Grazie, grazie a tutti voi per queste giornate. Leggerò il testo in inglese così come l'avevamo pensato e discusso io e Daniel. Quindi, the aim of this presentation, just to use it as a broader guideline, is to discuss the view by which Baroque is considered an appropriate and perhaps even indispensable category for the historians of philosophy. To non-philosopher historians, this presentation, or rather its main thesis, may seem entirely trivial. Of course, we do need the category of Baroque to describe and understand a certain philosophical and theological culture expressed in countless printed text and manuscript preserved in libraries across Europe and America and now accessible for the most part online. As we shall show, however, what may seem trivial to general historians is entirely to be rediscovered by history of philosophy. Our job here will proceed in 4 steps. First, we argue that there is a relatively little-known philosophical culture, namely the 17th century scholasticism, that should best be labeled Baroque scholasticism. Second, we present a brief account of its emergence. Third, we argue that this period should be viewed as a sui generis chapter in the history of ideas. Fourth, we give some reasons for mobilizing the historians of philosophy in its investigation. So let's start with the labels. In the 17th century, an alternative philosophical culture runs parallel to the well-known culture of so-called modern philosophy. The focal figure, of course, of this culture was Aristotle, but many other sources coming from Middle Ages and the Renaissance were drawn into it. Both in the Protestant and Catholic parts of Europe and the Americas, it was a dome and universities, seminaries, and other institutions of higher learning, and it was the mainstream philosophy of the time. This culture reached its peak between 1630 and 1680, and it was still alive in the mid-18th century in the works of such authors as Luis de Losada. There are probably only 2 philosophers from this tradition whose names might be occasionally heard outside of the small circle of experts, the Spanish Francisco Suarez and the Portuguese John of St. Thomas, or João Poinçot. The 2 are paradigmatic representatives of this culture, but by far not the only interesting ones, as we have said many times during these days. Historians of philosophy use various labels to refer to this culture and are very well discussed throughout last decades. Our suggestion is to call this culture Baroque scholasticism and take it to be the successor of Renaissance scholasticism, both being phases of post-medieval scholasticism. We should take up first the inaccurate labels referred to Baroque scholasticism, like late medieval scholasticism, early modern or Renaissance scholasticism, or perhaps second scholasticism as well. For time reason, we will leave aside them now and present it more accurately in the final paper to be sent for the proceedings. Our departure point here is that the labels have power. If something is called, for example, Middle Ages and lies in between Classical Age and Renaissance, or if, as we may hear in the USA background, Revival Age, then only a few will spend their time investigating it. Similarly, if something is called Renaissance scholasticism, the humanist criteria of evaluation tend to be applied. Again, if we label some period late medieval and the chapter on it appears in a book with a subtitle From the Rediscovery of Aristotle to the Disintegration of Scholasticism, 1100-1600, we will probably not spend much time to read anything later than Suarez's metaphysical disputations. A good and accurate label is needed in order to motivate and facilitate unbiased and thorough research. That means that the category of Baroque is one of the best candidates for being applied to this philosophical and theological culture. In many cases, the very same institution or even individual people produced both the art and the philosophical theological text of the time. And so we arrive to the emergence of the concept of Baroque scholasticism. It is not uncommon to speak of Renaissance scholasticism as a philosophical movement coinciding with what is generally called Renaissance art. Why is it then that almost nobody speaks of Baroque scholasticism during the time in which Baroque art flourished? There are at least three reasons, we think. First, the term has bad connotations. As Merriam-Webster puts it, the Baroque is a style characterized by grotesqueness, extravagance, complexity, or flamboyance. Hence, those who are sympathetic to authors such as Suarez or John of St. Thomas, out of respect, do not call them Baroque. Second, it is generally assumed that scholasticism died with Suarez, so that, properly speaking, there is no scholastic philosophy after him. The Baroque era has art, but no philosophy. Third, the few who do acknowledge the existence of the scholastic tradition in the Baroque era assume that it had no distinct physiognomy. Scholasticism lived in the Baroque, but only in the thoughtlessly conserved facade inherited from a glorious past. This presentation does not address these three reasons in general, for such task would have been too large. It simply aims to indicate that, first, what seems to be extravagant complexity is rather an admirable accomplishment required by the difficulty of the problems involved. Second, there is nothing wrong in being Baroque. Similarly as in art, we do not take this term to be derogatory anymore. And third, scholasticism after Suarez has features that justify distinguishing the Renaissance and Baroque phases of post-medieval scholasticism. In a very simplified way, one could argue that the Renaissance revival of scholasticism was initiated by Dominicans and transformed into the Baroque by Jesuits, with the addition of the strong voice of Franciscan later on. Dominicans were committed to Aquinas, Jesuits had nominalistic and empiricist tendencies, and Franciscans, both conventual and observant, were committed to Scotus. The Dominican initiators of the Renaissance revival of scholasticism were first French, Italian, and German, and then Hispanic. The latter played the major role in the formation of Baroque scholasticism. A major event of the 16th century, which in fact contributed to its transformation into the Baroque, was the well-known foundation of the Society of Jesus in 1534. One of the greatest cultural forces of the 16th and 17th centuries, quickly developed from his original group of 6 companions. The Jesuit activity had, of course, 2 priorities: missions and education. The 2 major Jesuit philosophers of the 16th century that succeeded in both priorities were the Spanish Francisco de Toledo, who wrote many commentaries on Aristotle, such as De Anima, and Pedro da Fonseca, dubbed the Portuguese Aristotle, who wrote innumerably reprinted Elementary Dialectics and commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics. The latter is a beautiful done work which included a Greek text, a Latin translation, and a detailed exegetical discussion, but also systematic treatments of topics inspired by the Aristotle's work, which goes, however, well beyond it. In a sense, Fonseca's commentary stands even today as a model of good philosophy done historically. Fonseca also supervised the writing and the publication of the Coimbra commentaries on Aristotle. The Jesuits were influential not only due to a number of great personalities, but institutionally as well. In 1599, they published the official plan for Jesuit education, which was a product of the 10 years of labor, debates, and experimentation. This plan gave an institutionally codified position to philosophy as an autonomous discipline for the first time since antiquity. The Scotistic school of the Franciscans underwent a great revival later, since the beginning of the 17th century. The landmark event for them was the first splendid edition of Scotus Opera Omnia in 1639. The 2 peaks of early Scotism in post-medieval era come around 150. Example, Antonio Trombetta died 1517, and then in 1650. With a few exceptions, all major Scotists were members of the Franciscan order, in particular the conventuals, and the observants constituted in 1517. The Capuchins, constituted in 1619, were not very active as scholars and did not adopt Scotius but Bonaventure as their master. The influence of Scotism, however, extends far beyond the Franciscan family, and some argue that it is the dominant force in the 17th century scholasticism. For the most part, Baroque scholasticism had a Catholic and Hispanic character. Nevertheless, in German Protestant countries, there was a revival of scholasticism too, starting with the work of Cornelius Martini in Lutheran University and Clemens Timpler in Reformed institutions. Cornelius Martini published his Metaphysica Commentatio in 1605. Clemens Timpler his Metaphysicae Systema Methodicum in 1604. It seems that Baroque Protestant scholasticism emerged independently of Suarez, since the Metaphysical Disputation became known in Germany only in the Mainz edition. Timpler explicitly points out that he could take Suarez into account only too late in writing his book. As pointed out earlier, Baroque scholasticism recognized the autonomy of philosophy, but it was predominantly theology-driven. Besides this theological scholasticism, there was also scholasticism driven by mathematics, science, and technology, especially in Jesuit colleges. But this type of scholasticism was or is more practical than speculative. Interestingly, for a long time, the standard theologically oriented scholastics were biased against their scientific colleagues. Mathematics was looked down upon in that it did not involve syllogism, but imagination, and only syllogisms were believed to constitute real proofs. The crucial person in dispelling some of the bias against mathematics, at least among the Jesuits, was the German Christopher Clavius, called the Euclid of his century. For many years, the mathematical and conceptual theological tradition within the Jesuit order lived side by side, sometimes without much interaction. In the latter part of the 17th century, some Jesuits, such as Giovanni Battista Tolomei, who was probably inspired by Juan Caramuel, began to apply mathematical methods to philosophical and theological problems. And so we arrive to the distinctive character of this so-called Baroque scholasticism. Whereas the basic history of Renaissance scholasticism is more or less known, our knowledge of Baroque scholasticism as such is much more rudimentary. One of the reasons for this fact is that the differences between Renaissance and Baroque scholasticism are not sufficiently understood. This section highlights some of these differences. One important feature of Baroque scholasticism has already been noted in the previous section. Baroque scholasticism is a blend of three philosophical schools that progressively became heterogeneous. A second feature of Baroque scholasticism is a great concern for systematic and complex thought. This leads to a third feature, namely a much looser attitude toward Aristotle and thus Aquinas. Suarez routinely complains about how disorganized the corpus Aristotelicum is. Others, such as Caramuel, even cease to be soi-disant Aristotelians. We may observe progressively freer attitudes toward the philosophical authority of Aristotle, Aquinas, or Scotus. The fourth feature concerns the increasing preoccupation of Baroque scholastics with the intramental world. Baroque authors describe the world with the sharpened awareness that its responsible description needs to take into account itself, that the world is not simply mirrored by our minds. The fifth feature has to do with individualism versus community attitudes. They share the terminology, agenda, and training, and this enabled them to reach a level of detail in their discussions unparalleled in non-scholastic philosophy at the time. Scholastics, in contrast to modern individualists, look at themselves as workers in a large network. But there is a difference between Renaissance and Baroque scholastics. In the Renaissance, the convention was not to name living adversaries, and most authors shied away from originality. In the Baroque, instead, individual personalities came much more clearly to the fore. Baroque authors engaged in extensive polemics with each other, and despite of obligatory references to some past philosophers, e.g. Aquinas or Scotus. This is not to deny that there are dissimilarities between the two cultures as well. Unlike, for example, contemporary Anglo-American philosophy, Baroque scholastics were system builders par excellence. Every Baroque philosopher aspired to write a complete cursus comprehending all of philosophy. We may say mammoth works. None of their major works is short, as we know. Finally, according to Zdeněk Kalista, Czech historian of the Baroque era, there is one specific feature of the Baroque: to reach God or something transnatural through the natural world. And so, why study Baroque scholasticism? That's the question. Why so few 17th century scholars pay attention to the Baroque philosophy? As far as we can say, there are at least two reasons. First is that the research on the Baroque is difficult. Any English-speaking student bold enough to study, it needs to face, for example, a linguistic barrier, namely humanistic Latin, then the lack of helpful secondary literature, again, a general skepticism as to the value of what he or she is doing, and finally, the enormous complexity and length of Baroque scholastic works. A second reason why Baroque scholasticism gets so little attention has to do with its sui generis philosophical culture and the need to approach it without bias and a priori evaluations in terms of standards foreign to it. The bias towards the Baroque comes from at least three sources. The first is inherited from the fathers of modern philosophy and their superficial or outsider knowledge of the scholastic culture of their time. The second source of prejudice against Baroque scholasticism comes from the Thomistic historiography of the 19th and 20th century. The third source of prejudice comes from the expert of Renaissance philosophy, both scholastics and non-scholastic. For instance, Charles Lohr, a confrere of Suarez and a great pioneer of Renaissance Aristotelian research, says, Cursus Philosophicus was meant to be an answer to the syncretism, skepticism, and the new encyclopedism which threatened the scholastic view of the world. Lohr assumes that the saints post-Tridentine professor had less direct knowledge of Greek and Arabic sources. They were increasingly narrow. Anyway, we have demonstration of many authors interested in looking at the tradition.
Emanuele, attenzione, attente.
Sì, l'ultima pagina, quindi dovremmo starci. Anyway, so we have, for example, Pedro Hurtado de Mendoza, Eustachio Santopaolo, Cosma Alamanni, Bartolomeo Mastri, Bonaventura Belluto, Rodrigo Arriaga, among the many others. It would be, of course, premature to make a definitive evaluative judgment about the qualities of Baroque scholastic culture. Moreover, there are various aspects which need to be considered. First, creativity. With few exceptions, Baroque scholastics did not try to create completely new systems or come up with quite new perspectives. They were creative in spite of their efforts not to be, but the creativity is not their strongest suit. Secondly, the kind of sources that Baroque authors take into account. In general, with the exception of Suarez, they did not try to take non-traditional sources into account. Besides a few standard classics, Aristotle, Aquinas, Scotus, and various commentators, they mainly discussed the view of their living colleagues. Thirdly, the diversity of topics. Every author aspired to deal with every standard issue. Within the framework of standard issues, various new subtopics emerged, but relatively rarely completely new topics emerged. The advantage of this approach was that issues were treated with the knowledge of overall place in a comprehensive philosophical system. The disadvantage was that nobody became a specialist in one or a few issues only. Fourthly, the quality of argumentation. This is the strongest point of Baroque authors. The detail and density of their argumentation is enormous. Their works could be abbreviated and some tangential issues left out. But in general, the complexity of their arguments is not due to superficial rhetoric, but to the inherent difficulty of the issues they dealt with. The philosophical culture of the Baroque age has certainly limitations. but it is also one of the most advanced and sophisticated culture in the history of philosophy, as we may argue. Its main virtue consists in trying to approach important philosophical issues with the detailed methods of rigorous analysis and argumentation, while placing them into the context of a comprehensive theory. So coming to the conclusion, we may say that using contemporary division of philosophical disciplines, the topics by which Baroque scholastics may enrich contemporary debates and include, for example, philosophy of religion, metaphysics, epistemology, logic and semantics, philosophy of mind and action, or rather ethics and political philosophy, sorry. So we offered here some ideas on why the study of the period has been, until recently, neglected and argue that more attention should be paid of it. And so for this point of view, we should prove that Baroque scholasticism could be in the toolbox of historians of philosophy. And so the next step is to be taken is to add it, and of course provide a proof of its durability. Grazie, thank you for the attention.